It's an honor for me to join this program, and my connection with Nishmat is primarily through my children, through my son and son-in-law. Sorry, through my son and daughter-in-law, and right now my son, who both teach there. Right now, my son is occupied, as many of the young men and women are occupied, and this year is. Aside from our importance of learning Torah, it's also the learning that we do should be in the merit of all the people that are right now protecting us, and that God should protect all the soldiers and protect all the people of Klal Yisrael. So it could be that the title that I chose may seem a little bit strange and maybe seem a little bit disconnected to Hanukkah, but in a certain way, it is more connected to Hanukkah than almost anything else that you can imagine. And I will explain. We called this the light, darkness, and unicorn. So let's start with light and darkness, and we will very quickly get to our unicorns. In the very beginning, we find darkness, and soon after darkness, of course, we find light. Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz, v'haaretz hayta tovo v'choshech, which means that before anything else, we find that we were full of darkness. And it's only after the darkness do we find the next step, where it says, Vayom Elokim yehi or vayi. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God caused there to be this separation between light and darkness. So there we have in the first couple of verses, one of the few things that we understand, or perhaps that we think that we understand, is light and darkness, or darkness and light, and they are immediately introduced, and lightness comes, and as the saying goes, maybe we'll come back to this, it expels the darkness. However, this seems a little bit more complicated, because soon we get to the second day and the third day, and it's only on the fourth day where it says, it's at this point that God creates the planets. And then we get to a verse which sounds a little similar to what we saw before. So we have light and darkness and light introduced on the first day, and then we have light and darkness again introduced on the fourth day. And on the fourth day, it's actually when the sun and the moon are introduced, which will cause some voices in Chazal, and I'm using that right now in its broadest sense, to try to search for and to find explanations to what exactly it is which is going on over here. But I will note that light and darkness, it's interesting that when we go back or go to Hanukkah in source number 2, one of the things we're told is that the mitzvah of Hanukkah is to light the candles at that moment, which is a confusion of light and darkness. It's mitzvah mishetishka hachama. So when the sun goes down, but before it's quite dark, it is someplace between light and dark. The way that this is referred to in halacha is bein hashmashot. And it's interesting what exactly that is. There are voices in halacha, and this was something which Rav Soloveitchik was fond of saying, is that in certain elements, bein hashmashot is both day and night, which means I can define day as only when the sun is there, and I can find night as when there's darkness. But what happens during that time when it's not quite dark, but there's no sun either? And that is bein hashmashot. So I can say it's a confusion, which maybe the word erev could even mean confusion. I could say it's a confusion, or I can say, on the other hand, that what it is has elements of both day and of night. But it's interesting. It's at that moment that we're supposed to be lighting the candles. And of course, like many other things in Judaism, then it's debated what exactly that moment is, and when is Shkia, and so on and so forth. But the truth is, the halacha for this moment concerns me less. We also find a Mishnah in Avot that Asar Dvarim Nivru Be'erev Shabbat Bein Hashmashot. And without reading the list, some of the commentaries here, and I recall seeing this in the writings of the Vilna Gaon, that these are the things which also is this erbuvia, or confusion, or connection, or multiple connections between a world connected to heaven and the world that we have over here. These are miraculous things which are part of a heavenly world, but also part of this world. And therefore, again, in terms of the idea specifically, Ben Hashmashot is a time of a mixture between two different worlds, a mixture of light and darkness. And of course, part of what we're trying to do is trying to expel as much darkness as we possibly can. But again, it's worthwhile to note. And of course, that Erev Shabbat Ben Hashmashot, that is when Adam already had been here and Adam already had sinned at that moment. And that also probably is quite important. There is in Midrash Rabbah, there's a phrase which is used over here, Amar Rav and Mosif al Tartin, and it's not so important what was mentioned before, but he says we can add to the previous list, Novlot Ora, Shalamala Galgalachama, Novlot Chachma, Shalamala Shema'alan Torah, that there's some kind of a light which is beyond the sun, and there's some kind of wisdom which is beyond the Torah. And both of these things are talking about elements which somehow are more connected to the heavens than they are to earth. In this dictionary, Musagim Talmudim, it says, what does that word mean if we were not familiar with it? Novlot, Pirish Shenishru Min Ha'ilan Kodim Shehiv Shilo. That these are things which, as it were, fell from the tree before they were quite ripe. Which means, in a certain sense, it's that the world is not ready for this. The world's not ready for that kind of light, and the world's not ready for that kind of wisdom. And therefore, when God gives us light that we can handle, he gives us the light of the sun. When God gives us wisdom that we can handle, he gives us the Torah. But a Jew should never believe that all the wisdom that exists, of God's wisdom, is in the Torah itself. There is God itself, which is beyond the Torah. It's not that all the light is in the sun, that there's some other type of light. This passage in the Midrash was used by the Rekanati. One of the reasons the Rekanati is important is that he was the first commentary to cite the Zohar in print. And he connects this with the passage of the Zohar, and he calls this other kind of light, this primordial light, as it were, he calls it Or Haganuz. And the idea of the Or Haganuz, you can see the Zohar in source number 7 talk about this other type of light, this light which is really being put away. It's good. It's this thing which was called Tov in the very beginning. It's the very beginning of the creation. And this is Ganazotan Tzadikim Latid Lavo. And we're not ready for that kind of light. That light is beyond us. So all that I say by way of introduction, and again, we're all the way back by creation or before creation, the moment of creation, and then we are by the 4th day of creation. We've moved out to the end of the 6th day of creation, and then we can move to this other person who may be very important in terms of creation. And this is a Gemara which is found in Avodah Zarah and Daf Chet. So very easy to remember. Again, Hanukkah is in the background of everything I'm going to say today. Kahn, of course, is 8 days. On the page 8, Daf Chet, in Avodah Zarah, it speaks about something which takes place for 8 days. It talks about a holiday that takes place for 8 days, and this is a holiday which is connected to the winter. Just to introduce this, the phrase winter solstice, the winter solstice you see I brought, is the exact moment when half of Earth is tilted the furthest away from the sun. It usually happens on December 21st or 22nd, at the exact same second around the world. That day is the day, for at least in our hemisphere, the day of the least amount of light. So the Gemara tells us as follows. Amar B'Chanan ben Rava, Kalanda, that was mentioned in the Mishnah, which led up to this. So it's a holiday. Shmon, not ours necessarily. Kalanda, Shmoni Yamim Achar Tkufa. This is a holiday which was celebrated 7 days post the winter solstice, right? The comment here says, from Rav Steinfeld says, Shel Tevet, Klomar Acharei Hayom HaKatzar B'yoter B'Shana. Starnura, which is another holiday, Shmoni Yamim Lefnei Tkufa. This was a holiday which was celebrated 8 days prior to the winter, to the solstice. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. Where did these holidays come from? Lefi shera'a Adam Rishon, Hayom shenitma'et v'holech. Adam saw that the days leading up to the winter solstice, every day was getting shorter and shorter. Amar, Oyli Shema b'shvil shesarachti olam chashach ba'adi. Maybe because of my sin, the world is really disappearing and it's getting darker and darker. And it's to go back to that point where there was only choshech. And this was the death which God had said would take place when they partook from the tree. Adam, those 8 days, prior to the solstice, he sat and he cried and he prayed during those times and he fasted. But we got to the winter solstice, and then he sees the days start to get longer. Amar, he says, this is a natural phenomenon that I was, till this point, unfamiliar with. He then celebrates for the next 8 days because the world, in fact, is not coming to an end. In the following year, Asa'an, by the way, that same phrase is used by Hanukkah, L'shana acheret, Asa'an elu ve'elu yomim tovim. Both the 8 days prior to the solstice and the 8 days afterwards were celebrated as holidays. Hu kav'am l'shamayim. He did this l'shem shamayim, and really in thanking God that he is still alive and thanking God the world still exists. V'him kav'um lo v'dat kochavim. And they had in mind for turning it into a pagan holiday. So this is absolutely fascinating. The Gemara over here talks about an 8-day holiday around, we can call it December, we can call it Kislev, around the solstice time, and it's a holiday which celebrates light and darkness. The Gemara continues and actually tells us that this was not the first time that Adam had this experience, and it continues and it says, Tanu Rabbanan, Yom Shenivrabo Adam Rishon. On that first day, we talked about that Beinish Mashot and the things that God created at Beinish Mashot. Kevin Sheshak'a Alav Chama. Again, Shkiat Chama. The sun goes down. For us, the time that we light our Hanukkah candles. Omar, and again, at the moment of Shkia, once again, it's not dark yet, just the sun is not there. There's still this residue of light, but it is moving towards darkness. At that moment, Adam says, Oili, Shemin Bishvil Shesarachti, Olam Chashach Badi. Maybe because I've sinned and the sun has now disappeared, maybe now we're going to V'choz l'tovavo. We're going to return back to a time of total darkness. V'zui mitashinik nisa alayim min hashamayim. And this is the death which was designated for me from heaven. That means that first Friday night, what did Adam do? He cried all night. V'chava bocha kenegdo, and together Chava, the two of them cried that night. V'kevan shalal amud shachar. By the way, this is before sunrise. It's just the beginning hints that light is coming up. Amar minago shalamhu. This is the way the world works. This is a natural phenomenon. Amad v'hikriv shor. He goes and he sacrifices an animal, a shor. Shekranav kodemit lefar sotav, which I'm not even going to explain. Shenamar, and it quotes a pasuk. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, shor shehikriv adam rishon keren achat haitalo b'mitzcho. It had one horn in its forehead. By the way, how do you call an animal with one horn? And the answer, of course, is a unicorn. So over here we see these elements of light and darkness, or darkness and light. And we find a unicorn over there, which Adam then offers as an offering. And the truth is that perhaps one could stop right here and say, okay, this whole discussion has very limited connection to Hanukkah, because yes, it's a holiday of light and darkness. And yes, we had this mention of the Shkiat HaChama and the Beinish Mashot and the setting of the sun. But when we moved over to the unicorn, you'd say, well, what does that have to do with anything? So I'll tell you something which you will have to spend time researching in order to come to the realization that, in fact, I'm correct in what I'm about to say. The Gemara and Chazal does not speak that much about Hanukkah. And that itself is an entire discussion why Hanukkah is not spoken about all that much. Something that there's actually an agenda over here. We're not going into that. But what I can tell you is that it's very likely, see, I'm being careful as I say this, it's very likely that an idea of a unicorn, and not even in the way that you think, is actually mentioned more than anything else when it speaks about Hanukkah. And let me show you, I don't know how many examples you'll need to see that I'm right. In Bereshit Rabbah, going right back over here to the beginning, Rav Shimon ben Lakish, source number 9, Patar Kiryah b'Goliot. He says this to do with Goliot. Va'aretz hayta tohu, ze golut Bavel, shenemar iti et haaretz v'hinei tohu v'vo. Ze golut Madai, v'avhilu lavi et Haman, v'choshech ze golut Yavan. Shehichshicha eneim sheYisrael b'gezeroteihem. That they darken the eyes of the Jews with their decrees. Shaita Omer Lahem, and by the way, this is the decree that is mentioned, which is not the decree you were thinking. There's all kinds of other things which I know in our minds that we expect to find the decrees about Hanukkah, and we don't find them in Chazal. That's part of the point. This is what we do find. that they insisted. They said, Kitflo Karen Hashor, right on, notice in the singular, right on the horn of a shore. Now you realize that Karen shore that I mentioned before has something to do with Hanukkah anyway. She'ein lechem chelek be'elokei Yisrael. That the Greeks somehow forced the Jews to write on the horn of a bull that you have no connection with the God of Israel, which at face value seems quite strange. Source number 10, another place in Rabbi, it says the same thing. Yavon, it says, if you want another place in Medrash Rabbah, source number 11, where again it says, it talks about they darkened the eyes of Israel. If you want another source, you have source number 12, same thing. It's mentioned in the Yerushalmi in source number 13, where it says, so we have this, and as I said, I did not even quote every single time that it appears, just to show you this is really a thing. And a lot of the things which are much better known about Hanukkah, you're going to really have a hard time finding it in the Midrash or in Chazal or in the Gemara. But this comes again and again and again. And now you realize that this thing about the horn of the bull is somehow connected to Hanukkah. Exactly how is not clear. And the commentaries have a hard time with it. The Korban Eidah says something interesting, which may go right to the core of Hanukkah. He says, so he's one of the commentators in the Yerushalmi, he writes in source 14, Kitzvel Karen Shor, you should grave in on its horn, so there you go. Why I'm going to skip explaining this. Why is it that we light candles on Hanukkah? Why are we so concerned with Persume Nisa in order to publicize the miracle? Because the Greeks over here, we're told, were concerned with publicizing that we don't believe or we have no share in the God of Israel anymore, which means a certain sense of that we need to publicize we have nothing with God. So it's interesting. Again, that was not in the text itself, but it is in the text of the Korban Eidah. That's how he read this. That's how, when he's trying to understand what are they doing? Why are they saying to write this? By the way, I can go a little bit further, because once you're writing words on something which is connected to the animal, I can even say, where are we supposed to light the Hanukkah candles? Lighted by the door. And the Gemara does mention something interesting. The door should be on one side and the mezuzah on the other side. And what does it say on the mezuzah? It says the Shema. Right? It says, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, this declaration that we believe in one God. So it's really interesting that they would want us to make this declaration, which is on the bull. We don't know why the bull. We don't know why the horn. That they want us to write almost like an antithesis of a mezuzah, where they want us to write the opposite instead of us saying, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, that we need to publicize that we have no portion in the God of Israel. And again, when we read this, we're not exactly sure what to do with it. One of the things in the back of our mind all the time when dealing with Hanukkah is that Hanukkah was not just a battle between the Jews and the Greeks. It was also a battle between the Jews and the Hellenized Jews. And one wonders, where something like this came from. Was this really coming from the Greeks, or the Hellenized Jews pushing the Greeks and saying, meaning, was it the Greeks really who wanted to take over the Beit HaMikdash, or was this something which was embarrassing for the Hellenized Jews? Was such a declaration, was this important for the Greeks, or this was something which was pushed by the Hellenized Jews? And obviously, I have no answer to this. The Sfat Emet in source 15, who's going to come to our problem. First, he mentions things which although the Gemara that he quotes is not necessarily dealing with Hanukkah itself. Over here it says, Ita ki hayavanim bikshu levatel gimel mitzvot, chodesh Shabbat u'milah. I'm going to say it again. Find in the Gemara where it says these things during the Greek period, and you're going to find yourself searching and searching. But nonetheless, these things, Chodesh, Shabbat, Milah, all of them are a front to Greek philosophy. I mean, first of all, they believe that the world always existed. And this idea of Hitchadshut, the idea of Shabbat, the idea that the body isn't perfect, that you can do Brit Milah, all of these elements certainly were things which the Greeks didn't understand or couldn't possibly connect to. But it's interesting along the way over here, as he's trying to explain that we believe in time and we believe that God gave us the ability of determining time, which, but again, I think the Greeks would have had a very difficult time with. He writes, Rak nira, on the second line in the middle, Rak nira pirush al kiddush hachodesh zeh charad lehem asher yu talui kedushat hazmanim b'Yisrael, that the Jews determine when time is holy. כמה שכתב ישראל דקדשינהו לזמנים. וזה שכתב בגמרא, שאמרו כתבו לכם על קרן השור, שאין להם חלק באלוקי ישראל. And it's interesting, he brings this over here, is that no, you don't have this connection with God. You don't have this ability of determining holiness. You don't have this ability of determining time. So again, it's interesting that he's looking for this way to fit this in as well, but you realize it's not as simple as the way that he's phrasing it. Rav Tzmi Elimelech Vidinov in the Igrid Dekala writes, regarding this thing, just in case you're feeling, hold it, I really don't know what this means. He writes, Ein lechem chelek l'kei Yisrael, this is Antiochus, Avinim Gazru Shechtuv B'Keren Asher, Ein lechem chelek l'kei Yisrael, V'davar ze yesh lo sod in Kahn Makomo. This is a mystery, and this is not the place for me to explain it. He also has a book called the Bnei Yisachar, or Bnei Yisachar, as he most likely pronounced it, and that's source 17, again, same author. And over here, he explains, Malchut Yavan Amar Yisrael, Kitvu Lachem Al Keren Asher, En Lachem Chelek Yisrael, Upirish Hadvarim Lo Noda. He goes, it is unknown. We do not know what this means. Now, by the way, just because he says we don't know what it means doesn't mean that everyone's going to agree with him. It doesn't even mean that he's, who in his other book tells us this, it's a secret and I can't tell you. Nonetheless, he continues and he does give us some kind of an explanation. He writes, Vini David shenim shach bekeren, that how was David HaMelech anointed? He was anointed, minastam shayu moshchim bo haya keren hashor. So now he says, hold it a second. The rejection of the Keren Hashor in his mind over here is actually a rejection of Malchut Beit David. And I hope you all realize that all of this is really quite ironic, because one of the things that the Maccabees were attacked for, which actually led some people to suspect that maybe that's the reason why we don't really appreciate the Maccabees all that much. And that's why Chazal may not have written so much. And some even suggested that Yehuda Nasi, who comes from Malchut Beit David, would have perhaps have pushed them aside, because the Maccabees, they kept the Malchut for themselves. And the Ramban tells us in Parshat Vayechi how this is a terrible sin that they committed. And it's interesting over here that he's reading into this a rejection of Malchut Beit David within the Keren. What is the use of a Keren in Judaism? And again, he searches, where does this Keren come from? What is the use of the Keren? And he says there's really a rejection of Malchut Beit David. Ein lam chelek hainu shayu omrim lachem shechapru legamrei b'Malchut Beit David hainu b'viat Mashiach haba min David b'mher b'yameinu achar kalot kol hamalchiot. He says no, that's it. What they were trying to say is that Judaism has come to an end. There's no hope for the future. There never will be a Mashiach. Malchut Beit David is over, and there will not be a Mashiach ben David. So it's interesting that Bnei Yisachar says, on the one hand, it's a credible secret. On the other hand, he says that we don't know it. And then he nonetheless, a couple lines later, gives us some kind of an understanding. But I will note in source number 18, there's an interesting Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, which probably needs, again, to be considered and to learn properly. But when it's talking about the Kiddush HaChodesh, one of the things that it says is the sign of the siman, ushachlo simana, the siman of Kiddush HaChodesh is David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam, which is most likely why we say that when we do Kiddush Levana, is because it is connected. So it's interesting that Malchut Beit David, which wanes. I mean, sometimes it appears and sometimes it disappears, is sort of like the moon. And we believe that just because one is a time of darkness, that doesn't mean that the light won't come and shine with incredible lightness. And the idea of just because we don't see Mashiach, that one day we will, Malchut Beit David isn't here, one day it will return. So what this whole idea is that it is somehow connected to the moon. But to deal with that point, I want to come back to something that I just now said, because I really brought the Ramban's approach that one of the sins of the Maccabees is this rejection of Malchut Beit David. And I want to make an observation in the Rambam, but first I'm going to make another observation. When we look at all of the holidays that we have, right, all of the holidays that we have, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, Purim, stop. Every one of the holidays are connected to a historical event that took place outside of the land of Israel. The only holiday that we have, till modern times, that commemorates and celebrates something that took place in the land of Israel is Hanukkah. Hanukkah is the most Zionistic holiday. You could say, well, Pesach was in order to get to Israel, and Shavuot, somehow it's about Israel, but no, but it's the historical element is really about Matan Torah, and Sukkot is about being in the desert, and Purim obviously takes place far away. The only holiday that we have in the calendar that connects to the land of Israel is Hanukkah. And that's something that we need to understand. Of course, in modern times, there have been other days that have been revealed, including Hey Iyar, Yom Ha'atzmaut, including Kafchet Iyar, Yom Yerushalayim. But until modern times, that didn't exist. Now, keeping that in mind, I want to read something in the Rambam, and that's going to, again, help us focus and then help us to go where we need to go. The Rambam tells us more about Hanukkah than we have in the Gemara, and almost everybody who subsequently quotes about Hanukkah will quote from him, unless, of course, they go straight to Book of Maccabees and so on. B'bayit sheni, kishemalchut Yavan gazu gzerot Yisrael, ubitlu datam, v'lo nichutam lasok b'torah v'mitzvot. During the Second Temple times with the Greeks, they made decrees. They didn't allow us to be involved in lives of Torah and commandments. Upashtu yadam b'mo'anan, and they reached out and they stole our possessions. Uvenoteim, and they grabbed the women as well, which is very interesting in terms of things that took place more recently. V'nichnasu lahichal, they went to our places which were holy, the Beit HaMikdash. Ufertzu bo pertzot v'tim'u atarot. They did damage and things which were spiritually pure, they made impure. And they caused pain and they caused difficulty for the Jews. Until, and look how he brings God now into the story, until God came, and God brought a salvation from their hands. He saved us. And the people, again, the Chashmonaim, who were the Kohanim, and the Kohen Gadol comes from that family. V'hargum, they got involved in battle. V'hushiu Yisrael miyadam. V'hemidu melech min haKohanim. V'chazra malchut Yisrael yeter amatayim shana ad chorban hasheni. And they went and they created a government. And I want to tell you something. The government that they created was what the Ramban was so upset about, is that the kings of the Maccabees became corrupt. The Maccabees ended up disappearing. They never should have held on to Malchut Beit David. But if you really understand what the Rambam just now said, the Rambam is saying is that the reason that we celebrate Hanukkah, and I'm saying aside from everything else, again, I can make this easier for you. There's two elements of Hanukkah. One is the battle that took place, which is the military victory, and the other is the miracle that takes place. If we had the miracle taking place with the light, but there was not a military victory, would we be celebrating Hanukkah today? Obviously not. The Rambam starts off describing the background of what Hanukkah is and tells us that sovereignty returned to the Jewish people for 250 years, which means the idea of having Jewish sovereignty is something which is enough of a reason to celebrate. And by the way, if you ever had a hard time saying, should I really say Hallel on Yom Ha'atzmaut? We say Hallel for 8 days on Hanukkah because we had 250 years of sovereignty, even though the leaders that we had at that time were not necessarily the leaders that we really would have wanted, because, as I said, they ended up becoming religiously and morally and spiritually corrupt. But nonetheless, we celebrate. So, you talk about light and darkness, and then you talk about the Shkiat HaChama, which is a time of the confusion between light and darkness. It's interesting that the Hanukkah story has this other element of this confusion of light and darkness, even as we move onwards. Nonetheless, the Gemara says is that after the military victory, Lashana Acheret, in the subsequent year, they took back, and Rav Soloveitchik, again, he insisted Lashana Acheret means sometimes you don't understand historical significance as things are taking place. Sometimes it takes time for understanding what took place, what the really had happened over here. And when they understood this point, it's not the perfect kingdom, it's not the perfect government, it's not perfect. But you know what? It's far better than being off someplace in Galut and someplace in exile and being at the whim of some other type of leader. That even our imperfect government, the Rambam is saying, is enough of a reason to celebrate Hanukkah, because we had our own self-determination, we had our own leaders for the next 250 years. Going back, because we still have some unicorns that we have to try to figure out what's going on. And now you're going to see that the various commentaries will go in every possible direction to try to understand this. In source 20, you have the Pirush of the Siddur of the Rokeach, and he tells us that somehow at the very end, he says, Laskir Cheta Egel. That, again, it's more likely the Mityavnim who are encouraging the Jews, you can reject Judaism. It's not the first time. You stood at Har Sinai and you made an Egel, which means it's okay to reject God. You've done this before, and therefore specifically right on the horn of a shore. Now, by the way, his commentary would be far more convincing if the Chet Egel was a Chet Hashor, but it wasn't a Chet Egel. So you see again, he has this, he's searching for an understanding, and therefore let's connect this to another point in time where we had sinned. You see, similarly, the Al Shech goes in the same connection, like Chazik Ba'avon Ha'egel, Shulamir et Kvodam Betavnit Shur, using the formulation. It's a little better what he did because he uses the formulation of David HaMelech in Tehillim, where he talks about the sin of the golden calf. There he actually uses that phrase, Lahamir et Kvodam Betavnit Shur. So again, moving towards the shore, the Maharal in source 22 as well writes, Ha'egel miyad shenatan lahem haTorah. Also, he explains that this is the idea of Al Keren Shirsh and Mechelek B'nei Yisrael. So you see three independent commentaries, all of them moving different times, places, all of them giving that same kind of approach that we're talking about. It's the Chet Egel. On the other hand, we have in source number 23, we have a different approach by the Kedushat Levi, or Levi Yitzchak, where he tells us that Ulahachi b'Chanukah dahaya de masa de Shimon v'Levi b'Shchem shehem garmu b'Shchem lefol sheyeh levneim Yeshua kedoma l'Shchem l'chein b'Chanukah hanes l'idei Chashmonai ubanav dahayu kohanim shebo mishevet Levi d'chein b'Shchem haya Levi halochem v'chein gam b'Milchama Chanukah. By the way, keep in mind that line that the Rambam mentioned about the daughters being taken. Over here, Dinah was taken, and what happened when Dinah was taken? Shimon and Levi go to war. Kohanim are going to come from Levi. So over here, he sees this precursor of the story. And one of the sons of the Maccabees' name was Shimon. So he is convinced that there is this connection. That's going to be funny. Ikrushor. Remez sheba otomasa shchema supalat lakor shor. Kima amram sheratzu yavnim sheichtvu keren hashor shenlam chelak b'lkei Yisrael. So it was a little convoluted what he did, because he starts with Shimon and Levi and he talks about how they go to battle, and we understood that. But then he goes in that also, according to Chazal, Rashi cites that Shimon and Levi were the first ones to pick on Yosef, and he says, and therefore he quotes Yaakov in the brachot. But he knows better. Excuse me for saying that. He knows better, which is why he used the word remez, right? Remez, remez from Asashchem, asupula lakoshor. And let me just try to explain this, because I think this may have been a little confusing. Once you solve your problems with violence, like Shimon and Levi did in Shechem, the next problem you have, which was called Yosef, you go and you solve that by violence as well. Which means, in a certain sense, the sale of Yosef takes place because, or actually before the sale, the attempted murder of Yosef takes place because of what happened in Shechem. That's pretty much what he's saying, and that itself is confusing, because on the one hand it sounded positive, on the other hand it doesn't sound as positive. If you look at 24, you'll notice something interesting, because it actually says, Ki ba'apam hergu ish uveratzan imkru shor. Okay. Now, who's the shore? So saying the shore is apparently, it's Yosef. Well, hold on to that for a second. In source 25, it says, mazal yavan hu shor, the Yarod Tvash of Yonatan. It says it's well known that the mazal, that what connects to Greeks, is a shore. I don't know how well known this was to you. And therefore he goes and says, that's why it says Ketfuel Kevin Shor. And that's why Ki Shimon and Levi akru shor. So again, if this part of the Shir is a little confusing, it's okay. It's because people are really trying to find some kind of a connection to writing on this horn of this bull. By the way, none of them touch the idea that it's only one. It's kind of, okay, where do we find any kind of reference to shore? And let's try to, fit it in. The Megale Amukot, source number 26, Rav Shapiro, he writes, Sha'az nit'ar chet Yosef. That's the Sod Ketul Shemon. It's about the chet Yosef. But by the way, I do want to mention one more thing about Yosef. Yosef, for the Mityavnim, for the Hellenists, may have been a hero. Yosef is the one who fits into alien society. Yosef is the one who fits into the Egyptian society. He's the one who doesn't obviously dress like a Jew. Perhaps there, and Rav Kook went in this direction, not on this issue, but in a larger issue. He felt that the Midyavnim would have seen their poster child in Yosef. That Yosef, but of course, it is a twisting of the Yosef story because Yosef always remains Yosef Hatzadik. But over here, Yosef, you see a number because of this idea of the shore. Look at source 27. It's Yaakov's bracha, ben prat Yosef, ben prat alein, banot sada alei shore. Now, this doesn't say shore, it says shore. Shore over here means wall. I mean, you can see the English translation because it's not shore. In Dvarim, on the other hand, when Moshe gives the bracha to Yosef, it's Bechor Sharor Hardelova Karnei Im Karnav. So Yosef being connected to a shore takes place not for the obvious, what you would think from Yaakov's bracha, unless you go back to the Shimon and Levi, but there is something about Yosef over here about the Karnei Im. Let's leave that and let's try now to understand all of this a little bit better, because as I said, we're still missing something, which I'm going to try to explain. Source 29 is probably more important than I'm going to hint right now. I will note it speaks about the fight between Yosef and the brothers. This is the point that they were afraid. Yosef comes back. This is after they had buried their father. And now they're terrified what Yosef will do to them. And according to this, Yosef says, the 10 brothers couldn't get rid of one of me. How can one of me get rid of all 10 of you? But it's fascinating that the metaphor over here is candle. It's light. The Gemara then goes right into something, and this is Megillah. So we should be talking about Purim. Okay, light is Torah. Remember, light is Torah. Kinem mitzvah Torah or. Sason zamila, b'ikar elut tefillin. Now, and it goes on to say elut tefillin shabarosh. So the various elements over here, light, right, mila, tefillin, some of these more easily are connected to our Hanukkah story, some of them, especially milah, especially Torah, especially mitzvah. Tefillin, we don't know what to do with yet, unless you do. So, note the following. When Moshe comes down the second time from the mountain, we're told, this is source 30, Moshe mehar Sinai shnei luchot edut biyad Moshe brudeto menahar, u'Moshe lo yada ki karan or panav bidabro ito. That Moshe didn't know that his skin, or here is indeed with an ayin, although if you go looking, you'll find all kind of commentaries who spell it with an aleph, just their memories fool them. Ki karan or. Moshe's skin glows, he glows. But I do want you to note the word karan, because the word karan over here, which means glow, is probably a little more interesting than we imagine. Yes, someone's going to tell me that Michelangelo understands it's actually the Jews have horns. Rashi's commentary also says, and not his commentary in Chumash, but Rashi goes in a similar direction. He talks about rays of light, rays, and he goes, the rays look like a horn coming off of Moshe. So Michelangelo may actually have had somebody explain to him Rashi. But I'll tell you something which is interesting. If I would have asked you before I read the Pasuk, and I stressed which time this was Moshe coming down, when does Moshe glow? Is it the first time or is it the second time? So people's minds play tricks on them there because they just figured after the incredible experience of going up to Sinai, Moshe would glow, but it's not the first time. It's the second time, and that's very interesting why that would be. I'll also note that we have this other time about there is this confusion between or and or, between the skin and between light, and that's in source 31, where God makes for Adam and Eve right after their sin, which is really where we started today, Ktonit or, L'yal b'shem. And very, very compassionate even after the sin. God takes care of them and he gives them clothing of leather and he clothes them. In Bereshit Rabbah, we're told that Rabbi Meir, on the margin of his Chumash, and I insist the margin here, it's not that he didn't know what it said, it's that he felt that there was a deeper meaning. U'b'toratosh Meir matz'o tuf k'tonit or. Here we find that instead of leather, it talks about clothing of light. And so on, that the clothing was clothing of light. The Ben Yehoyada, or the Ben Ishchai, he tells us, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he tells us that Adam had light on his body before they sinned. That there was this incredible aura about him of light that was flowing. The Al-Kolzet Tzadikim, and he talks about how Tzadikim still have an aura to them. But it's fascinating because the original primordial light disappears. And then we have this other light. And Adam sins, and this original primordial light on Adam and Eve disappear. And what takes the place of it? What takes the place is instead clothing of or. So therefore the aleph gets switched to an ayin, and it's different types of clothing then appears. The Gemara tells us, and now we're moving back to Moshe's getting the glow the second time. And this will explain why it's the second time. The Gemara, this is Shabbat, it talks about Matan Torah. Dorish Rav Simai, when the Jews said Naseh before Nishah, all the angels came and they put crowns on the heads of all the people, one for Naseh, one for Nishma. And then all these angels came and took away their crowns. So Edyam is the word in the Torah. Edyam could mean jewelry. So, or in this case, it's understood as something spiritual, that there were these spiritual crowns. As we said, Perku, it says, what happened to all the light? Isn't there all the crowns? Isn't there a theory of conservation of crowns? All of that combined spiritual power, which was on all of these crowns, Moshe took. Moshe took the tent. As it says, now, all of this is really difficult to understand. Look what Rashi writes in 35. That this is light, and I'm going to add something which it doesn't say. This is part of the original light. This is for the light coming from the Shekhinah. Over here, Rashi continues and he tells us, Moshe yikach oto edei lashon acher et haohel lashon bihilu nero v'hu haya kiron or panav. That when all of them lose the light and Moshe gets this concentrated light of 600,000 Jews, now Moshe has upon him all of this light, and that's why Moshe's face glows, which means essentially Moshe was supposed to receive all of this light when he came, when all the Jews were supposed to have all of this light, which means there was this light that was lost at the very beginning of creation. By Matan Torah, it comes back. If all this wasn't clear enough, then we'll go to the one person who's going to make sense of all of this, and that's going to be Rav Nachman from Breslov. In source 33, Lakutei Maharan. Moshe gamkin zachar or hatfilin. Moshe merited the light of tefillin. Moshe katuv b'zohar v'nitzlu et edyam da tefillin. So the Zohar already understands that these crowns that all the Jews had, meaning they had crowns on their heads. What's a crown on your head? It's tefillin. Moshe took the spiritual properties of tefillin. There was an aura coming off of him. What was the aura? The aura was the tefillin. Vizehu kikaran or panav, and that is the glow that's on his face. Al shem karen achad hayelo b'mitzcho. What is this? It's a unicorn. That means a Jew who wears tefillin and has tefillin sharoshan. It looks like a unicorn. Zeh b'chinat tefillin. Now this is absolutely fascinating. Then he goes back and he tells us that the Jews who stood at Sinai were supposed to get this spiritual power on them. Ki Adam Rishon pagam b'chinat tefillin shem b'chinat eitz hachayim. And it said v'dibek et atzmo bilana demuta, which is the way it's called in the Zohar. It's the tree of life and the tree of death, right? The tree of death, not the tree of knowledge, the tree of death. Ilana demuta. V'edei zav yigrash megan eden. V'yaslam k'tonat or, that's tefillin. Meaning, what does he give them made out of leather? He goes, that's tefillin. V'zeh pira shor shekriv adam harishon keren achat hayta lo b'mitzcho ke'edei korban hayno idei tshuva zachad levchinat tefillin shu b'chinat keren or hapanim. So this is interesting because before I tried to explain as much as I could that maybe it was connected to the mezuzah, that there you write Shema Yisrael. Well, there's another place that you write Shema Yisrael, and that's on the tefillin, which means essentially what this is trying to say to us that a Jew wearing tefillin is a unicorn. Now, of course, you'll tell me that unicorns are mythical animals. Well, Jews are somehow mythical as well. That we are mythical in the sense that we are connected to something that took place before or the very beginning of creation. That somehow there was this primordial light, and this primordial light God put into this world. But what happens to the primordial light? It gets chased away. And we have the light of the sun, and we have the light of the moon, and we have this time of day and with this time of night. What the Greeks come into is they reject all kinds of light. And when light is rejected, the way that they articulate this is to write on the horn of, again, on this horn, singular, which Rabbi Nachman, I think, brilliantly, again, you have to understand what Rabbi Nachman, it's as if he visualizes it, and that's why he gets to his interpretation. He visualizes one horn, and therefore it's a unicorn. So therefore, right on that unicorn, but when he sees the unicorn, what he sees is this replacement for tefillin. But then we go into this whole other idea of light. God created man with light. Man expelled light. When man stood by Har Sinai, we're supposed to accept the Torah and light comes upon us. But then we sin with the golden calf and that gets expelled as well. Moshe Rabbeinu then gets this light because this light is still going to be in the Torah. This light is still going to be in the world of mitzvot. And what happens is, as long as we live our lives of Torah and mitzvot, this aura is still with us. Yes, there's one way of actually physically trying to connect to this aura, and that way is actually physically connecting, is putting on tefillin, but that's a physical representation of something which is spiritual, which is exactly what Rabbi Nachman is trying to explain, is that the aura that Jews should have, the light that we should have, is something which is connected to this naaseh and nishma. It's connected to this world of Torah and mitzvot. It's connection to the asiyah. It's connected to the shmiyah. I'll tell you something the Vilna Gaon said, that you remember, all of us remember, there's this famous teaching in Chazal that God went to all the various nations and he offered them the Torah. What does it say? And so on. And one was, of course, Esav, and one was, of course, Yishmael. The Vilna Gaon says that Naaseh is Keneged Esav and Nishma is Keneged Yishmael. And therefore, our Naaseh Nishma took all the spiritual power which was designed for the Asiyah of Esav and the Shmiah of Yishmael, and that's something which we have. Which means this Naaseh Nishma creates this aura, it creates this light, and we all had it upon us. When we get to the story of Hanukkah, we get to this point where the Jews are now, we're rejecting the light. We're rejecting the aura, rejecting the Torah, rejecting the mitzvah. We're rejecting Naaseh Nishma. And the Greeks or the Mityavnim are encouraging us to write on the horn, on that unicorn, to write on the horn of the bull and say that we no longer accept Israel. This anti-tefillin, as it were, to declare that we don't accept God, we don't accept Torah, we don't accept mitzvot. Our asiyah now will be against Shema Yisrael. Asiyah is against Shema. There's no longer Naaseh. There's no longer in Shema. We completely reject all of it. And at that point, there will only be darkness. But what happens? We fight against that. And therefore, we refuse to write on the horn of the bull. Instead, we get this mitzvah to do at that time of darkness, or almost darkness, at the time when the sun has set and there's no obvious light. It's at that particular moment where we're given this mitzvah to go and to light these candles as it goes into darkness to light. Because, and again, this is a very famous teaching, but I think sometimes we're not exactly sure who said it, but I'll show you. You do see him. I'm skipping somewhat over here. But in the Chovat HaLevavot, he's the earliest source that I found. Ki hama'at min ha'emet yinatzeach harbe min ha'sheker. That's so important for us to know today. Anybody who's unfortunate enough to watch, listen, or read the news, a little bit of truth can be victorious over a lot of lies. Ka'asher, just like hama'at min ha'or, docheh harbe min ha'choshech. Just like a little bit of light can extinguish a great deal of darkness. The story of Hanukkah is a story of Eretz Yisrael. It's a story that even though in our land, people in their land should have a certain degree of freedom and have a certain degree of comfort and a certain degree of stability. That stability being shook and us losing our comfort and us getting to this place of being afraid is what the story of Hanukkah is. It's losing our sovereignty, which is why the Rambam then can say, hold it, getting our sovereignty back, that's something which is worth celebrating. Having our own leadership instead of the czar, instead of whoever it may have been throughout history, that's something which is significant. This attempt to get rid of our Na'aseh Nishma, to get rid of lives of Torah, get lives of the theoretical study of Torah, or for that matter, the practice of Torah, the Na'aseh, the Mishah, the Asiyah, and the Shmiah, that was something which the Greeks and the Mityavnim try to push us to. But it's interesting that the lighting of the Hanukkah candles, which now within the context that we saw of Adam HaRishon from the very beginning, thinking that light has disappeared, that the world is being destroyed, and we're moving towards a time of darkness, that there is a holiday at this time of year, which goes all the way back to Adam. It goes back to the first day of Adam, afraid that darkness is coming into the world. It comes to when Adam gets to this time of year for the first time, and then they get celebrated by realizing that sometimes there's darkness, but then afterwards comes light. And even when we're in times of darkness, we need to believe that the light is coming. And even when we're about to enter into a night, or about to enter a time of darkness, and we get to the Shkiat HaChama, and we get to that point that the sun has set, we light our Hanukkah candles because we know that light will always be able to defeat darkness, and we believe in that light, and we believe in our world of Torah, and we believe in that world of mitzvot, and we believe that this aura can come upon every single Jew who performs Torah, does mitzvot. It's this light of mitzvot comes upon us. We pray that the current situation will be improved quickly. We pray for all of our soldiers that will come back safe in body and in mind and in spirit. And we pray that all of Am Yisrael will be safe. And we pray that the truth will extinguish all of the lies, and that the light will get rid of all of the darkness. If you have, are there questions? I don't know who's in charge. And I posted the sources that can be given to the people. Yes. So I don't see any more questions. So, Bezrat Hashem next year, either Matatiao or Shir will come and teach, and therefore you won't need me to teach. It's interesting about Chava and Tefillin. I actually saw, I have to go, it's a footnote in one of my books, but I actually saw that it's connected to the Cheta Egel. And because it said that man sinned with the Cheta Egel, so therefore they had to wear tefillin as a tikkun. And the woman who didn't sin with the Cheta Egel, there was no need for women to wear that kind of an expression of the belief, because they never had lost it. So I did find such a comment.